Welcome to the Thing About Salem. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Our ancestors were examined for witch marks.
In 1618, English legal writer Michael Dalton published a handbook for magistrates, instructing them that devil's marks would be found in their secretest parts and therefore required diligent and careful search.
Cotton Mather explained that familiar spirits were devils in bodily shapes that gave responses or received orders for doing mischief.
These ideas crossed the Atlantic and became practice in Salem. In June 1692, women like Rebecca Nurse and Elizabeth Proctor were stripped and examined.
Today we're looking at the dehumanizing practice of searching for witch marks and how it was used to convict innocent people in Salem.
So where did these ideas about witches' marks and familiar spirits actually come from? Let's look at the men who created this so-called evidence. Many of the ideas used to prosecute the Salem Witch Trials came from English legal texts. Texts by people like William Perkins and Richard Bernard and Michael Dalton, who we quoted at the top. And they laid out what witches' marks were and familiar spirits and how to identify witches' marks. William Perkins, in A Discourse of the Damned Art of Witchcraft, laid out 7 types of evidence that could be used to try someone for witchcraft. One of those evidences was to find a witch's mark, or teat.
We mentioned Michael Dalton. In his Country Justice, he said that witches' marks were like blue or red spots, flea bites, or with the flesh sunk in and hollow. So it's a really broad description. It sounds like the human body to me. He says, quote, "These the devil's marks, being sensible and being pricked, will not bleed, and be often in their secretest parts, and therefore require diligent and careful search."
And Richard Bernard, in The Certainty of the World of Spirits, tells us where many witch marks have been found in witch trials in England. They've been found on the crown of the head, on the breasts, on the thighs, on the butt, on the neck, on the chin, on the shoulder, on the flank, under the ear, under the flank, under the eyebrows, under the armpits, within the lips, and in the secret parts.
He tells us various marks were left, ranging from spots to protuberances like small nipples.
These English writers laid out detailed instructions about what to look for and where to search. But was any of this actually in the Bible?
No, it was not laid out in the Bible. Robert Califf, a critic of the Salem Witch Trials, published More Wonders of the Invisible World. And in that book, he points out that the evidences that the men in court are using to identify witches are not spelled out in the scripture. But the search for witches' marks wasn't the only test authorities used. Let's look at some of the other methods they employed to identify witches.
Yeah, there were several. As we mentioned, William Perkins had listed 7 things to test. 3 of these were used in the Salem Witch Trials. Witches were supposed to not be able to recite the Lord's Prayer.
You may remember that Reverend George Burroughs is reported to have given the Lord's Prayer at the gallows, but it didn't save his life.
Another test that they did that specifically related to witches' marks was called watching. They would keep a person awake for a couple days, maybe a few days, and they would just watch to see if a familiar or an imp came to feed from a witch's mark. And then a third test that was often done in the courtroom was called the touch test. And basically what would happen was if an afflicted person who had been bewitched, allegedly, was touched by the witch, the curse or spell that had gone into the afflicted person would go back into the witch. And so if somebody who was having a fit stopped and became well upon touch, then the person who touched them was a witch.
The authorities, Perkins and Bernard, actually said what the teats were supposedly for.
So the teats were practical in nature in that they offered nourishment for the familiar spirit or imp that accompanied the witch. So I know there is a case in Salem where a woman fed her familiars directly through her actual breasts. There's also there for the devil's sake, to use as his brand. He put his mark on the people that served him. Once you signed a contract with them, basically you were his for the length of that contract. And so he or his devils would leave a little mark on your body. In the absence of somebody actually bringing in the book to show that there was a contract signed with the devil, that mark on their body someplace was the proof that they were working with the devil.
So the supposed mark was also the proof that there was a contract, that there was a devil's book, that an alleged witch had signed their name in the supposed devil's book, because something on their body was identified as a witch mark.
Yeah. Fun. But this raises the question, knowing what the witch teat is for, what is a familiar spirit actually?
As we opened with, a familiar spirit is to be able to cause a devil to take bodily shapes. The community would identify familiars as any kind of animal that they imagined they were seeing too. So a devil would take the form of something we might be familiar with, like a cat or a bird. And then it can give responses and it can receive orders to do mischief.
Yes. And in Salem, familiars did appear as almost every animal that was familiar to the settlers. There were birds, cats, rats, dogs, snakes, hogs, monstrous creations that were amalgamations of different creatures. And we'll get to more details on those in a little bit. They're pretty fun to look at, some of those monsters.
This evaluation of the body was dehumanizing to the ultimate degree. They were invasively searching bodies, and the interpretation of a witch mark was wide open.
Yeah, these searches meant being stripped, examined in private areas, having pins driven into your flesh to test whether this witch's mark would bleed or whether you were sensitive when it got poked. And this was systemic dehumanization.
So let's take a sampling of the teats and the familiars that are in the records of the Salem Witch Trials.
I want to look at the men and then the women. And I think you'll notice a key difference in what happens with the men versus the women. So I'll start with the men. John Proctor, John Willard, and George Burroughs were examined for witches' marks in jail, and they were found to have none. But when George Jacob Sr., who was 82 or 83 years old, was examined for teats, he had 3 of them. A pin was run through 2 of those, and he did not feel it. So they were insensible. He had one in his mouth on the inside of his right cheek. He had one on his right shoulder blade that was drooping about 1/4 of an inch long. When a pin was run through it, no substance oozed out, no blood, no pus, no bile, no nothing. And then he had a 3rd one on his right hip.
The women were searched by women. Let's look at what those experiences were like. Tituba was examined for her witch's mark by Hannah Ingersoll on March 1st. She was criticized by the magistrates for holding her arm during that examination. And according to Reverend Hale's writings, after this, they said Tituba was again examined in prison, and being searched by a woman, she was found to have upon her body the marks of the devil's wounding of her. Sarah Good, who was executed later, her husband William asked Hannah Ingersoll if she saw a little wart or teat below his wife's right shoulder, and there's no record of whether she saw it or not.
The other recorded search of women for witches' marks occurred on June 2nd, 1692. A jury of women came into the court in Salem and examined Alice Parker, Susanna Martin, Sarah Good, Bridget Bishop, Elizabeth Proctor, and Rebecca Nurse. This was the first day of trials in the actual Salem Witch Trials. So Alice Parker, Susanna Martin, and Sarah Good at this point in June were found to have no witches' marks. Bridget Bishop, Elizabeth Proctor, and Rebecca Nurse, on the other hand, all had a preternatural excrescence of flesh between ye pudentum and ye anus. And Bishop's was gone, though, when researched 3 or 4 hours later. And Proctor's had also disappeared by this time. Where Nurse's still was there, but appeared as only senseless, dry skin on the second search. And Rebecca said that this mark was left after a difficult childbirth.
She also requested a re-examination by qualified individuals who would recognize that.
Another person who was found to have a witch's mark, but wasn't necessarily physically examined with the same rigor that they gave to the adult women, was the young child Dorothy Good. She was about 4 or 5 years old in 1692. And according to Reverend Deodat Lawson, in his book about the Salem Witch Trials, A Brief and True Narrative, quote, on the 26th of March, Mr. Hathorne, Mr. Kerwin, and Mr. Higginson were at the prison keeper's house to examine the child, Dorothy Good, and it told them there it had a little snake that used to suck on the lowest joint of its forefinger. And when they inquired where, pointing to other places, it told them not there, but there, pointing on the lowest point of the forefinger, where they observed a deep red spot about the bigness of a flea bite. They asked who gave it that snake, whether the great black man. It said no, its mother gave it.
And Dorothy's supposed snake wasn't the only bizarre familiar described. What other creatures did the accusers claim to see?
Here's one of my favorite ones, comes to us through Tituba's examinations. She described another thing, hairy. It goes upright like a man. It hath only 2 legs. Let's talk about John Louder's rooster thing that he saw, because it was a hybrid. He said that a black thing jumped in at the window and came and stood just before my face upon the bar. The body of it looked like a monkey, only the feet were like a cock's feet with claws, and the face somewhat more like a man's than a monkey's.
Afflicted woman Susanna Sheldon claimed Goodwife Buckley had been a witch for 10 years, and that she'd opened her breast and the black man gave her 2 little things like young cats, and she put them to her breasts and suckled them, and they had no hair on them and had ears like a man.
Yeah, witch marks were ordinarily very incriminating because, like we said at the beginning, they were proof of the covenant with the devil and therefore witchcraft. But the court of Oyer and Terminer that met in Salem in 1692 convicted everyone that was tried before it. 27 of 27 people tried in the year 1692 by that court were convicted, regardless of the presence or absence of a witch's teat.
Whether it was George Jacob Sr. with pins driven through his flesh, Rebecca Nurse explaining postpartum scarring, or 4-year-old Dorothy Good's flea bite-sized spot, the court convicted everyone tried in 1692.